This episode of Trifles is brought to you by the BSI Press. Manuscripts, collections of papers by international writers, and books covering a wide range of other Sherlockian topics. Find them online at BakerStreetIrregulars.com. Welcome to Trifles, a weekly podcast about the Sherlock Holmes stories.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Yes, Gables, Garridebs, and students all came in 3-packs, but there are so many other details to pick apart in the stories.
Pray, be precise as to details.
You know the plots, but what about the minutiae? What's the difference between a gamekeeper and a gatekeeper? Between a Tregennis and a Tregallis? Between a Jack in office and a Mr. Cocksure?
You are very inquisitive, Mr. Holmes.
It is my business to know what other people don't know.
Scott Monty and Burt Wolder will have the answers to these questions and more in Trifles.
The game's afoot.
Episode 208, Handwriting. Well, greetings and welcome once again to Trifles, the Sherlock Holmes podcast where we look at some of the minutiae in the Sherlock Holmes stories. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Burt Wolder.
And Burt, are you well written?
Yes, I'm scribbling. I'm dripping with ink. Oh my goodness, I better get a paper towel.
That's the wonderful thing about podcasts is no one sees the ink stains on your hands.
No, it's true.
Well, let's get these ink-stained memories into your brain as we require you to listen to the Administrativa here on the show, where we tell you that the show notes for this episode are available at ihose.co/trifles208. That will take you to SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. That's our homepage to this specific episode. If you'd like to comment on it, if you'd like to submit other ideas for where we might go in 2021, we'd be open to that. Just email us at trifles@ihearofsherlock.com. Again, that email address is trifles@ihearofsherlock.com. We'd like to thank everyone who's been contributing to our Patreon, the support there. It's been growing, and we do appreciate that. It helps us keep the lights on here and continue to do the research that is necessary to bring you these fine shows. We'll have news about the next season in the very next episode, so make sure you stay tuned to episode 209. Meanwhile, let's get writing. In this episode, we're looking at handwriting in the canon, and it comes into play very prominently in one particular story, which we'll get to in a moment. And it does play out in other minor stories. But before we start to unpack that, why don't we explore exactly what was going on in the Victorian times and Edwardian times when Sherlock Holmes was around? Of course, we had very few working typewriters outside of a case of identity. Most people corresponded by hand, and we even have a lot of surviving artifacts of Conan Doyle's, the letters that he wrote. And the wonderful manuscript series that we see from the BSI Press in Conan Doyle's own hand. It gives us a sense as to his thought process. We see how very few additions or corrections he made to himself, and just how neat his handwriting was, particularly as a doctor. Now, what do we know, Bert, about the use of handwriting and even handwriting analysis during that time?
Well, we know that it fit in with general popular culture in Victorian times. And, this was a time when obviously spiritualism, which featured prominently in Conan Doyle's thinking, and many other people, by the way, spiritualism too, which went back really to America and the great loss of life in the American Civil War. But also the Victorians were interested in things like fortune telling and obviously fairies and photography. And a variety of, many variations around mysticism, animal magnetism. So there is this sort of element of charlatanism around their interest. But people at the time were interested in translating observations into knowledge. And that's why so many people were naturalists, were collecting, were exploring, were in their own way following Darwin in looking at the natural world and seeing what conclusions they could draw from it. And so it was logical that people would then look at handwriting. And it features, the observation of handwriting features, as you say, in your mention about Conan Doyle's own hand, in Watson's observation. Watson finds this note or that note rudely scrawled or hastily scribbled. But Holmes's writing, Watson tells us, was very precise, although he could disguise it, one imagines, to suit whatever particular case he was on or whatever character he was creating. But, one of the things I always think about, if you think about Holmes and handwriting, is you think about the great moment in The Final Problem when Watson is looking at the note Holmes left behind at Reichenbach and says it was characteristic of the man that the direction was as precise and the writing as firm and clear as though it had been written in his study. And, so Watson in his way is sort of an amateur observer of handwriting and graphology and drawing conclusions from the way people put ink on paper, just became more and more popular at the end of the 19th century.
Yeah, and Watson, having known Holmes for some time at that point, by the time we got to 1891, they had been together for a decade. I'm sure he had received plenty of notes from Holmes or had seen the notes that Holmes had scrawled from time to time. He knew Holmes's physical and mental state. He could tell when he was in a state of excitement or a state of lethargy or calm. And for Watson to make that observation about Holmes's clear, concise handwriting, that should have told us, the readers, something about what was going on there, that Holmes wasn't nervous about his encounter with Professor Moriarty. In fact, he was quite confident about how things would wrap up, or at least how he would handle the outcome of this. And even though graphology as a practice has never been scientifically recognized, it's kind of like astrology, but with more of a physical connection to the being. You can read into personality traits, you can read into mental states when people have expressed themselves in handwriting. And as a matter of fact, in The Norwood Builder, Holmes uses the handwriting in the will, not to determine the mental state of Jonas Oldacre, but to determine when and where and how he wrote the will.
Yeah, and I've always found that particular passage a little suspect, because that's the passage, isn't it, where Holmes, in fact, not only does he deduce that it was written on a train, or conclude or observe, not really a deduction, he observes it was written on a train, but he also observes the line by, isn't that where that happens, because he's looking at, oh, geez, here's a pause, so they must have taken so many minutes to get to this point in the line and that point in the line.
Yeah, he handed the will to Lestrade and said, there are some points about that document, Lestrade, are there not? Said he, pushing them over. The official looked at them with a puzzled expression. I can read the first few lines, and these in the middle of the second page and one or two at the end, but those are clear as print. But the writing in between is very bad, and there are 3 places where I cannot read it at all. Huh, what do you make of that? Said Holmes. Well, what do you make of it? That it was written in a train. The good writing represents stations, the bad writing movement, and the very bad writing passing over points. A scientific expert would pronounce at once that this was drawn up on a suburban line, since nowhere, save in the immediate vicinity of a great city, could there be so quick a succession of points. Granting that this whole journey was occupied in drawing up the will, then the train was an express, only stopping once between Norwood and London Bridge. A scientific expert, indeed.
Yeah, well, the nice part is that in the editing, I'm sure Herbert Greenhouse Smith did this at the Strand. He cut out that paragraph where Lestrade says, well, wait a moment, Mr. Holmes, aren't you just presuming then that someone began writing without interruption? That's not a characteristic of the way I compose. Why, it could take me, of course, I'm a lot slower than you, said Lestrade, but it could take me, an hour and a half to write a coherent paragraph. I mean, I stop and start and get a drink. Why are you looking away, Mr. Holmes? You see, Mr. Holmes.
I couldn't put out a whole paragraph if I were on the Orient Express. No, it's a great point. It's a great point. So, again, the way we look at handwriting can fit to the theories that we're looking to put forward. And as the Wikipedia entry says of graphology, it's generally considered a pseudoscience. A pseudoscience. And to think that Holmes was dabbling in something of a pseudoscience in making his deductions, we're grateful that it turned out that he was right. But it could have gone sideways pretty quickly.
Well, he makes many accurate observations about about certain inks and certain pens and certain papers, that are really fundamental and interesting to the story. But too, we should point out that this is an age because as you said this earlier, this is the primary way people communicated. And so this is an age when you were in school, you were taught a very precise way of making letters, about putting your marks on paper and forming letters. And we know from Conan Doyle, Dan Stashower and John Lillenberg did this collection of Conan Doyle's letters to his mother, A Life in Letters. And it's pointed out that when Conan Doyle was writing home, and he wrote home frequently to the ma'am, his handwriting was, in some cases, he'd write on the backs of things, he'd write sideways, he'd write hastily. And she apparently had no difficulty deciphering the scroll. But how unlike that in comparison to someone who's writing down for words that are going to be said in type. And often Conan Doyle's manuscripts would then go to a typist who would produce multiple copies that were then further edited. So it is interesting. But Conan Doyle's script really was just lovely.
It was unique. It certainly was. Well, more about unique handwriting right after this quick word. When the BSI Press began producing hardcover books in the early 2000s, the first was Angels of Darkness, a drama in 3 acts. This was a facsimile of the original manuscript by Arthur Conan Doyle. It was a play version of A Study in Scarlet. Another early publication was Chapter 11 of The Hound of the Baskervilles. This was one of the only extant chapters left in manuscript edition. Since then, the BSI Press has gone on to produce a number of books in the manuscript series where you can actually look at facsimiles of the manuscript in Conan Doyle's own very legible handwriting. There have even been a couple of sets produced, the Texas set and the Harvard set, which I believe are both sold out at this point. But not to worry, there are plenty of facsimile editions of the manuscripts available, the most recent being The Worst Man in London, about Charles Augustus Milverton. Why don't you get on over to BakerStreetIrregulars.com and check out the BSI manuscript series for the full run today. All right, we are back talking about handwriting in the canon and getting very quickly to the one reference that everyone knows, the story that was centered around handwriting. Before we do, we ought to mention a few other minor notes about handwriting in the canon. The Noble Bachelor, Holmes was able to deduce a little bit about Robertson Simon, that he used a quill, which was an interesting choice of writing implements.
Yeah, I always found that fascinating too. I never realized until I'd read that people were still using. I mean, it's why the penknife came into existence.
Right.
You would have a little knife so that you could actually sharpen a physical quill. I always presumed by this time nobody was actually using.
Well, you look at the characterization of Lord St. Simon, and he's kind of a fop, and a little sequestered in like a mosquito or a fly captured in amber, kind of beheld to a certain date and time. So that would be consistent with the rest of his personality.
Yeah. But to your point, it's also consistent with the conclusions Holmes draws in other instances about things he encounters in terms of messages on pieces of paper for people. So, for example, in Scandal in Bohemia, Watson was trying to imitate Holmes's process. And I think he mentions, I'm trying to follow my colleague's footsteps. Watson looks at this note and comes to observes that this paper is very expensive. But look what Holmes pulls out, the Germanic structure of the sentence and all those other things.
That's an interesting angle. Well, why don't we talk a little bit about the Reigate Squires, or the Reigate Puzzle, depending on where you read the story. This was, a wonderful story in that the murder victim, William Kerwin, was discovered holding a corner of paper in his hand that had a couple of words on it. And by that very small handwriting sample, Holmes was able to draw some conclusions. Take us through
lovely.
That.
It's lovely. Holmes, when we see, I think it's Inspector Forrest. So the inspector finds this piece of torn paper found between the dead man's finger and thumb. And Holmes immediately says, this writing is of extraordinary interest. And these are much deeper waters than I had thought. And even though, most of this letter is missing and the envelope is supposedly have been destroyed, Holmes looks at this fragment and sees written upon it a 11:45 midnight, and it concludes that it had been written by two different people taking alternate words. Now, I think in general, anything that was written by two different people, you would be aware of it almost immediately. I've never come across anyone who had a handwriting that looked much like mine. I mean, I always find handwriting to be very distinctive. And that really becomes central to the entire operation in this particular case, because Holmes will then, trick someone he suspects into writing one of these words. And, then we'll eventually find the missing larger part of the letter. But whether or not there's a family mannerism, that was another one of Holmes's conclusions. Holmes, although, I don't know, I think my handwriting occasionally looks more like my father's handwriting. So maybe there are family manners. Do you think there are family mannerisms in handwriting?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I can see in my own handwriting some of my father's and some of my mother's influences coming through. It's not a particular carbon copy of either one. It's an amalgamation, and it's my own unique style as well. So, and I don't know if that's something. This would be an interesting one to put to Holmes. If that's something that comes through genetically, or if it's simply by virtue of corresponding with them over time that we maybe subconsciously mirror what the other does. Now, in the case of the Cunninghams and their plot, they could very well have been trying to imitate each other in creating this alternate word note. In which case, they actually did a very poor job because it was discerned by Holmes.
Yeah, that's a great observation. It's interesting.
But you have to wonder if Kerwin got a smaller piece of paper, if it was just one word that was on there, how Holmes would have come to the conclusion. Would he still have been able to solve the case?
Well, I mean, that is very interesting, but and he does draw, some other conclusions from looking at the handwriting. He, isn't this the case too, where he looks at the handwriting and he, basically looks at how letters are formed and says, this is indicative, this shakiness is indicative of heart disease and so on and so forth. Isn't that part of the same?
Yeah, that one was an elderly hand and the other was a youthful one.
Yeah, interesting.
But it was those Greek E's that gave them away. And that is just a trifle.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Please join us again next week for another installment of Trifles. Show notes are available on SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. Please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and be sure to check out our longer show, I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, where we interview notable Sherlockians and share news of the Sherlockian world.
You've taken my breath away, Mr. Holmes.
That's my brother Mycroft. He writes like a drunken crab. You'd better read it. Doctors are more used to hieroglyphics than normal human beings.